Hey guys, welcome to StudyIQ. My name is Prashant Dhawan, and in this video we will talk about the recent ban on the sale of cattle for slaughter. Now this is a very important topic. We will cover it from all angles. Now, before discussing the ban, I just want to clear a very basic concept. In India, we have animal markets. Alright, now these markets are of course organized in order to sell animals, of course. Farmers, what they do is, suppose I'm a farmer and I have a lot of buffaloes and I'm a little short of cash. So I have the option of selling one of my buffaloes in these markets for some cash. Now, it is not necessary that I'm selling my buffalo for slaughter. Alright, it can be sold for agricultural purposes. Suppose if some other farmer is looking for cattle that produces milk, then he can also purchase from this market. But what a lot of farmers do is, whenever their cattle is old and isn't of any use to them anymore, they just take their cattle to one of these markets and then they sell them off to a slaughterhouse. Now this is where the central government has intervened with this ban on the sale of cattle for slaughter. So now that we have understood this basic concept, let's understand what the ban is all about. Now a very basic question is, how has the government of India intervened in these animal markets? Well, they have introduced a new set of rules that will regulate the trade of the sale and purchase of cattle in these markets. And of course, they have banned the sale of cattle in these markets for slaughter. That means if there's a farmer who wants to sell his old cattle in this market, in one of these markets for slaughter, then he cannot do this anymore. Alright, so these new rules are called Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, Regulation of Livestock Markets Rules 2017, and these rules have been framed under Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 1960. Alright, so in the notification that had all these rules, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change declared that these rules will be imposed in all of the states, of course, except Jammu and Kashmir. So this can come up as a question in your prelims examination. So you make sure that you know about this, that these new rules will be applied to the entire country except Jammu Kashmir. So now that they have banned the sale of cattle for slaughter in these animal markets, how exactly are people supposed to trade in these markets now? Well, in order to understand this, we must read the section 22 of these new rules. So, section 22 of these new rules imposes a set of restrictions on the sale of cattle, requiring a written declaration from the seller explicitly stating that cattle have not been brought to the market for sale for slaughter. Now, suppose there is a farmer Ramu and there is another farmer Shamu. Now, both of them they want to trade. Ramu has a buffalo and he doesn't want to sell his buffalo for slaughter. Alright, he wants to sell his buffalo to someone who wants to use it for agricultural purposes, as his buffalo is quite young and it is quite productive. Alright, Shamu over here, he wants to purchase. Now, according to these new rules, Ramu, when he enters the market, he must give a written declaration that he does not intend to sell his cattle for slaughter. And Shamu too will have to give a written declaration that the animal that he is purchasing from Ramu is being purchased for agricultural purposes and not for slaughter. Alright, so you can understand that how stringent the new rules are, and they require a lot of written declarations and a lot of assurances from the buyer and the seller in order to make a proper transaction. Now, we have been using the word cattle a lot throughout this video, haven't we? So let's just understand what are the animals that actually come under the umbrella of cattle. Alright, so these new rules define cattle to mean cow, calf, bullock, bull, buffalo, heifer, steer and camel. Alright, now I'll just explain the difference between cow, heifer, steer and bull. Just although they probably won't ask this question in the UPSC preliminary examinations, but since we are discussing this entire subject in depth, let's just understand this as well. So, the government of India says that these new rules have been introduced on the directions of the Supreme Court. Now we will discuss this as well, how the Supreme Court comes into the picture. But first of all, let's just understand the difference between cow, steer, heifer. Now over here you can understand what is the difference between a cow, heifer, bull, steer. A cow is basically a female animal that has had at least one calf. Okay, once it gives birth to a calf, it becomes a cow. A heifer is a female animal that has never had a calf. So once a heifer has calf, she automatically becomes a cow. Alright, simple. So a bull, I'm sure most of you know what a bull is. It is a mature male animal that is used for breeding purposes. Okay. Then steer. A steer is basically a male animal that has been neutered. That means its reproductive parts they don't really work anymore, and it has been done so by humans. Now we can understand that all the names that have been given over there, the rules that define cattle, what do they actually mean by cattle? They mean cow, calf, bull, bullock, buffalo, heifer, steer and camel. Now you might be asking, why have they given so many details, or what's the point of this? They could have just written cow ban or something like that. But well, it's important because a lot of people, they try to find loopholes in these laws. Suppose if the notification stated that you cannot sell cow for slaughter, then someone will say, okay, so I can sell a heifer, right? So since it has not really given birth to a calf yet, it isn't a cow anymore. So people try to find loopholes. So the government of India, of course, has tried to corner them from every angle and make sure that there aren't a lot of loopholes that can be exploited. Now, in order to understand the Supreme Court connection, we must understand the Gadhimai festival first. It will all connect. Have patience. Now look, Gadhimai festival was a sacrificial ceremony that was held every 5 years in Nepal, in the southern part of Nepal, that is close to Bihar. So, as I said, it was a sacrificial ceremony. That means a lot of animals were sacrificed in this ceremony every 5 years. And when I say a lot of animals, I mean a ridiculous amount of animals. It is estimated that around 50,000, that is right, that is just crazy, 50,000 animals were sacrificed during the Gadhimai festival of 2009. Okay, and this whole ceremony, this festival, it is primarily celebrated by Madhesi and Bihari people. So what happened was, in 2015, Nepal's temple trust announced that they plan to cancel all the future animal sacrifices at the Gadhimai festival. Now this decision was taken under a lot of pressure. A lot of animal welfare organizations around the world, they raised their voice against this act, and of course PETA too raised its voice. But during this timeline, a very interesting thing happened. In 2014, let me just show you in a slide. In October 2014, Gauri Mulekhi, she is a consultant of the People for Animals Uttarakhand Trustee and Humane Society International. She filed a writ petition against the illegal transportation of animals from India to Nepal for slaughter. Now, according to her, a lot of animals that are sold at these animal markets that we just talked about, they are taken to Nepal illegally. They are illegally transported to Nepal, and then they are slaughtered at the Gadhimai festival. Now, the court looked at the whole petition, and the court too found that the argument does hold some water, and perhaps this is happening. And in July 2015, the Supreme Court asked the government of India to make guidelines to stop this illegal transportation of animals. Okay, and in order to do that, a committee was also set up by Supreme Court, and suggestions were made by this committee. This committee was headed by the director of SSB, Sashakt Seema Bal. Okay, so this is how it was unfolding. What happened after that? A year later, in July 2016, Supreme Court gave its final order. Okay, so Supreme Court asked the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change to frame guidelines. That is why the new rules have been notified by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Alright, so according to the Supreme Court, all these new rules must be made under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 1960. Alright, and the new rules should be named Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Regulation of Livestock Markets Rule 2017. So this is how we eventually came to all these new rules. At least this is the official version. that all these new rules have been made according to Supreme Court's order. Now, what is the purpose of these new rules? According to the central government, the prime focus of these new rules is to protect the animals from cruelty and not to regulate the existing trade in cattle for slaughterhouses. Now, why was this line added? Well, the thing is that the authority to regulate the existing trade in cattle, this comes under the state government's jurisdiction, not the central government's jurisdiction. So, the central government is just trying to make it clear that our primary objective is just to protect animals from cruelty. We are not trying to regulate the trade of cattle. Alright, so this is one thing. I will explain this a little more. So, other than that, the new rules according to the central government, they have also been made so that adequate facilities are provided to animals in such markets, like a proper housing, food for them. They should be fed properly. There should be proper water supply. There is also a provision that suppose if an animal is about to give birth, then that animal cannot be sold. So according to the central government, there are a lot of other dimensions to these new rules as well. Now, in order to make sure these rules are implemented properly, because implementation of course is a big problem in India, 2 new committees have been constituted. This is quite important for your UPSC preliminary examination. So make sure that you note this information. The first committee is District Animal Market Monitoring Committee. Now this is for the registration of animal markets. All the animal markets must be registered under this committee in 3 months. Alright. In 3 months, all the existing animal markets must be registered under this monitoring committee. Now, of course, this will work towards bringing all the animal markets under a single scanner. Then we have Animal Market Committee. This will work on a more local level. It will work towards the management of these markets, and it will also make sure that all the small rules that we talked about are implemented and the animals are not in discomfort. Other than that, this committee will also try to make sure that the cattle that has been sold in these markets are actually being used for agricultural purposes and have not been slaughtered. Now that all that is cleared, let's focus on some very basic questions that people might ask. First of all, after discussing all this, I'm sure most of you will be able to answer this question. Can cattle be sold at all at the animal markets? Of course, yes. Cattle can be sold, but only for agricultural use. And it also requires the market authority, of course the people from the 2 committees, to collect undertakings from both the parties, buyers and sellers, and ensure that they are not, the cattle of course, that they are not being traded for the purpose of slaughter. Okay, so this is the first question. Second is this a countrywide ban? Well, of course it isn't. Well, technically it isn't, because Jammu Kashmir has been excluded. This is quite important. Again and again I'm telling you, make sure that you remember this. Finally, is slaughtering of cattle illegal overall in the entire country? No, absolutely not. The government has not made slaughtering of cattle illegal. However, considering the ban and the regulation, it will be difficult for slaughterhouse business to survive. Now, look, why will it be difficult for slaughterhouse businesses to survive? Because the government has said that you cannot trade cattle for slaughter in the animal markets. But if you want to trade individually, that is fine, that is permissible. But again, this is so difficult, because how is a farmer supposed to find a buyer who is willing to buy the cattle? Now that is a big problem, right? So in the market it was very easy, and of course the sellers used to get a good deal as well, since there were a lot of buyers. It was basically a good ground for trade. Now suppose if a farmer has very old cattle and he just wants to sell them, now how will he do that? How will he actually manage to find a good buyer and fetch a good price? So he will definitely be in loss. Now here are some other points that you should probably know about. First of all, the purchaser of cattle cannot sell animals for slaughter or sacrifice the animal for religious purpose. Now suppose if I went to the animal market and I bought some cattle for myself. Now I cannot be a very smart guy and go outside the market and then sell the cattle again to a slaughterhouse. That cannot happen. The government has made sure that the new rules cover this aspect as well. Other than that, I cannot sacrifice the animal for religious purposes as well. Okay, so both these aspects have been covered. Other than that, the rule mandates the appointment of a veterinary inspector. Well, we talked about this. Okay. Other than that, this is quite important as we talked about the Gadhimai festival. In an indirect reference to Bangladesh and Nepal, where most of our animals are smuggled illegally, the rules further state no animal market be organized in a place situated 25 kilometers from a state border or which is within 50 kilometers from an international border. Now, these rules have been made so that it becomes more and more difficult for the people who transport animals to other countries illegally. They should face more difficulties so that, of course, the animals can be saved according to the government. All right. So these are some of the very important questions that can be asked as a question in your preliminary examination. Now, a very important question that can be asked is center encroaching on the jurisdiction of the state because of these new rules? Well, the answer is no, not exactly. Why? Well, because the Environment Ministry has notified these new rules under animal welfare. Animal welfare is overseen by the central government, not the state government. Although all these new rules will eventually impact the cattle trade in states, and the regulating cattle trade comes under the state government's jurisdiction. But since the intention of the central government is to make sure that animal welfare is taken care of, then all these rules, they pretty much come under the jurisdiction of the central government, and they are not really encroaching on the jurisdiction of the state government. Now let's discuss the adverse impacts of these new rules. First of all, imagine that there is a farmer. He has some cattle, but he can't really feed them, he can't really take care of them, and he's very poor. Now earlier he had the option of taking his cattle to the animal market and then selling them off for some cash, and then he could have purchased some new cattle and start some new business with that cattle. But now that option is closed. So what will that farmer do? Most probably he will just let all his cattle loose. Since he can't really feed them, he will just let them loose, and that cattle will just add to the already huge population of stray animals in India. That is a big problem. Other than that, there are also a lot of drought-struck areas in India, drought-struck states in India. For example, recently Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh was very much affected by it. Now, as you probably know, in a drought, a farmer suffers a lot. Now, earlier, a farmer, he was able to feed his cattle, he was able to make sure that they survive as well. But now he doesn't even have food for his family. How will he feed the cattle, right? So earlier, again, as I told you, he had one last option of selling his cattle for some money so that he could just survive. But now even that option is closed. So I can imagine that when these new rules were introduced, I think probably a lot of farmers who owned a lot of old cattle, they were very disappointed. They were probably shocked. Other than that, these new rules will also have adverse impacts on the dairy industry. How? Well, some estimates suggest that over 40% of a dairy farm's income is derived from the sale of unproductive cows. Now, as you know, in a dairy farm, there are a lot of cows. Eventually, some of them get old. Now, what the dairy farm does is they sell the unproductive cows in the animal market for some profit. Now, from that income, they expand their business, they buy new cattle, they do all sorts of things, they buy new machinery. Now they cannot do that. Alright. So if there is no longer a market for these cows, the unproductive cows, the production cycle of dairy farmers will be jammed. They won't be able to progress. This holds true for large dairy farmers as well. Like it or not, these non-productive cows will need to be replaced by younger stock, and no farmer is foolish enough to invest his or her precious money in a white elephant. Now, they have pretty much made cattle into white elephant, haven't they? Because once it gets old, you can't really do much about it. You just, it is a deal that will eventually end in loss for the investor, right? So a cow or a buffalo under these laws has no resale value, at least if you want to sell it through a slaughterhouse. then it has no resale value. Now there is an international factor in all of this as well. What is the international factor? Well, as I told you that the dairy sector will suffer a lot because of these new rules, right? And countries like Australia, New Zealand, US, they are just waiting to dump large volumes of subsidized milk powder into India. Now our dairy sector is fighting very hard to stop this, and again these new rules will eventually end up helping these countries like Australia, New Zealand and US. They will actually be delighted by these new rules, and because it will eventually cripple the Indian dairy sector in the long run, and it will just make the job very easy for all these companies, all these countries and their companies to earn more profit from India, right? So it's a bit odd that to secure the welfare of animals, all this is being done, and so many people will eventually suffer because of these new rules. Now, as we discussed earlier, buffalo comes under these new rules, right? So the problem is that this will impact a lot of other industries as well. The leather industry, the beef industry. Well, we shouldn't really call it beef. It's made from buffalo meat, so we should call it buff. Buff is the right word. So look, India exported leather worth around $5.6 billion in the financial year 2017. Now you can understand that this industry is huge. It provides employment to a lot of people. Now if the buffalo leather will be difficult to find, now how is this industry supposed to prosper, right? So as you can see over here, the Council for Leather Exports in India, the vice chairman of this council, they have made this statement that only the buffalo is of concern to us because that was allowed for slaughter. We are only asking for exclusion of buffalo from the notification. So this is pretty much legitimate. Since this industry is prospering, it provides a lot of jobs to a lot of people, and it is eventually providing a lot of tax for the government as well. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to include buffalo in the ambit of these rules. Okay, so this is one problem. Other than that, the buff industry, I should call it, the buff industry will suffer as well, as I told you. So all these problems are, as you can see, they are multiplying. All right, the intention was to secure animal welfare, and it is just having a domino effect, and it is affecting a lot of other industries, and perhaps lakhs of people might find themselves jobless. Now, as we were talking about the leather industry, let's just discuss this very unique feature in the new rules as well. Even the carcasses of dead animals cannot be used or sold or flayed for leather. So you can just understand how miserable the people from the leather industry must be feeling, because buffalo isn't really considered holy. It doesn't really have any religious significance, yet all these rules have been made, and the industries is being crippled. So this is quite odd. Now, since we have discussed so much about the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 1960, let's just discuss a little bit about Animal Welfare Board as well. It is a statutory advisory body, and it was made to advise the government of India. All right, the Animal Welfare Board of India was established in 1962 under the Section 4 of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 1960. The board was initially within the jurisdiction of Government of India's Ministry of Food and Agriculture, and later on in 1990, the subject of prevention of cruelty to animals was transferred to the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, where it now resides. So this is pretty much it. If you have some opinion on this entire matter, then you can write it in the comment box below. We will all be glad to know what you think about it. And yeah, just make sure that your language is proper. Just maintain the decorum. And thank you for watching this video. I will make another video on a very important topic soon.